There's one simple tip which makes successfully throwing shallow bowls just that bit easier, and it's all about how you distribute the clay prior to opening the lump up and throwing the form. But first, let's spend a few moments getting to that point. For any vessels that are wider than they are tall, I tend to throw them on throwing batts like this, as it makes lifting the thrown form away from the wheel just that bit more straightforward. For this quick demonstration, I'll be throwing some shallow bowls from about 2 pounds of clay, which is just over 900 grams. With any wide, shallow bowl, it always feels like you're using a lot more clay than necessary, but there's good reason for that, which you'll see when I begin throwing these. But first, as always, the lumps of clay need to be wedged. If you look at the lump on the left, you can see that it's made up of various pieces pushed together. If I were to begin throwing with this immediately, those voids and crevices you can see in the clay would just trap pockets of air, and if not dealt with, you'll encounter these when you throw the piece on the wheel. You'll feel them as a large bubble within the piece of clay you're working with, and whilst you can pop them with a potter's needle as you're throwing, but even the fact they've been there can create a permanent unevenness in the walls of your pot, which means the entire lump will simply be more difficult to centre and throw with. So wedging clay to remove air pockets and to make sure the weighed out clay is even in texture throughout is crucial when throwing pots on the wheel. I smear the back of the MDF batt with water, and then I place it onto the pad of leather hard clay and tap centre it. And then to make sure it's really stuck, I sort of rub it back and forth in place, like so. I then very lightly dampen the area I'll be throwing the clay against. This helps the piece of clay stick against the porous wood. Now, the tip for successfully throwing a wide bowl is all about the shape of the centred lump you begin with. In this case, I'll be doing it the wrong way first, and then I'll throw another bowl with the clay in the right place. So, if my aim is to throw a wide, shallow bowl, and I begin that process with a shape that's quite tall and narrow, this means that when it comes to throwing the walls outward, there won't be material in the right place to support the overhanging walls. This is because every time I dig my knuckle into the base to pull the clay up, the base section gets progressively narrower. And when it comes to finally correcting the inside form, there simply isn't enough supportive clay down here to brace how much I need to push inside to make the form nice and rounded. And this all becomes especially noticeable if you're throwing these with very soft clay, or if you throw the walls too thin to support themselves. Throwing bowls with bases this narrow isn't impossible though. You could use a gas torch to stiffen the clay at this point to save it, or you could simply throw with firmer clay. There's an easier solution, I think. But I may as well throw this and see the vessel collapse. Now, with this second lump, the centering and throwing are more or less identical. What changes is the shape I make the initial lump, which I open up. After coning the stoneware up and down a few times, I'll press it down into a low disc shape, which means there'll be more clay underneath the overhanging walls, supporting them, and hopefully preventing them from sagging over and collapsing. Here's the shape I want. And let's quickly compare it to the piece of clay I centered previously. Now when I press my knuckle in and pull the clay up, the base, over a few subsequent pulls, won't become nearly so narrow, and I should be able to throw the walls so they overhang without flopping over. As I'm pulling, if I feel like the walls are undulating a tiny bit around the rim, I'll clasp it with 2 wetted hands and compress it down ever so slightly, just to bring the rim of the pot back under control. After which the pulling up continues like normal. I use the knuckle of my index finger on my right hand to push into the base, which squeezes up that excess clay into the lower portion of the wall, which I can then lift up and outwards. If I feel like either of my hands are becoming too dry throughout this procedure, I'll gently remove my hands from the pot, scoop up some water, and place it back onto the spinning vessel. Also, as a rule, I try to never let the rim of the pot get too thin as it's being thrown, as a thick rim keeps the pot stable. And with the shape almost there, I'll sponge away the excess water. I'll then use a curved plastic kidney to refine the interior shape. But before I do that, here's how much clay I've got supporting the overhanging walls, as compared to the previous bowl. With the first bowl, which had insufficient supportive clay, when I pushed down with the kidney to scrape away the slip and to make a lovely smooth interior, the walls struggled to retain shape and then collapsed. But with the form thrown with the wider base, doing it is easy, and my goal at this point, although demonstrated on a smaller form, is to craft a bowl that has an interior that, if a sphere is rolled into it, it'll rock gently back and forth and come to a natural stop, without colliding into throwing rings that are too dramatic or any other strange changes in shape. As the glazes I use tend to go on quite thickly, I don't worry about making these curves completely perfect, as the molten layer of glass that will eventually coat this does that job for me. And more than anything, I just want to get rid of as much slip as I can, as if I leave this covering the pot, it'll take a much longer time to dry out properly. I then tidy the batt up, scraping the slip off that too. And then I use a very old blunted turning tool just to remove the worst of the slippy clay underneath the bowl. And lastly, I want to do a small bit of decoration around the rim. Nothing dramatic. Those of you who've watched my videos for long enough will know that I'm not really into decoration, things like frilly rims or surface texture, and I've always preferred just to keep things simple. So in this case, that'll be just a slight indentation and a rim that flares out, just enough for my glazes to react nicely over. And I'm just using the sharp edge of a metal kidney to make sure this step is well pronounced. And despite getting it so refined at this stage, I'll probably trim this section once it's leather hard too, as it'll be easier to make it perfectly defined without having to worry about the shape being deformed as I press the metal against it. And if I had initially thrown this rim to be very thin, there's no way I would have been able to alter it like this. So it's worth remembering to keep the rims of your thrown pots thick if you plan on doing something like this. And from this side view you can easily see all that extra supportive clay in the base. To remove the batt from the wheel, I'll very gently pry it away using the same metal turning tool I used for cleaning up the base. I'll also let this piece dry on the batt overnight, and then only in the morning will I wire it off. This means the pot will keep its thrown form perfectly, and as it was thrown on a batt, I can simply lift the wood away without touching the actual pot itself, which means there's just one less chance for the piece to be deformed. Anyway, I hope you found this simple tip helpful. I've previously made a much more thorough bowl throwing guide, which I'll leave a link to down in the description below or on screen now. Thank you so much for taking your precious time to watch, and I'll see you next time.